Thank you for watching, guys. Today is Africa Liberation Day, May 25th, 2020. We are here to discuss with Comrade Justice Henaku of the Socialist Forum of Ghana the meaning of Africa Liberation Day for the African continent, the African world, and the entire world. Why it's important, how it came about, and who contributed to the Africa Liberation Day. The Africa Liberation Day is a commemorative date of the organization of what we call today the African Union. On May 25th, 1963, it was formed as the Organization of African Unity. A few decades ago, it changed its name to the African Union. Many people contributed to the creation of the African Union, and it had an essence around Pan-Africanism, around Africans coming together to take control of their own affairs on the continent. This is why we felt it would be appropriate on today to discuss with Comrade Justice Henaku, as I shared, from the Socialist Forum, to find out more why this date is important. Welcome, Comrade Justice.
Thank you very much, Comrade Kambale.
Yes. As I indicated, today is a very important day for the African continent. A few African countries celebrate this holiday as a national holiday, others do not. And some youth on the African continent also celebrate that, and others do not. But why do you think, in your view, Africa Liberation Day is important? And what is it for you first? Let's look at first the historical background of it. How did we come to have Africa Liberation Day?
Yeah, thank you very much, Comrade. It's indeed, today is Africa Liberation Day. It's variously called African Freedom Day and Africa Day. But the essence of it is that it commemorates the struggle of the African people from bondage, from oppression, and from colonialism and imperialism. And that struggle merges into other struggles. The struggle for women emancipation, the struggle for minorities, etc., etc. So it is not a monolithic celebration of only a political struggle. It is economic, it is social struggles. And we must situate African Liberation Day not only within the context of the African Union. We must situate it within the context of the struggle of the African people worldwide for emancipation. So the antecedents for African Liberation Day could go as far back as 1900, when the Pan-African Conference was first held, and its subsequent meetings in London, Paris, culminating in the significant conference which happened in Manchester in 1945, which set out instructions or directives about how to go about the immediate task of liberating the Africans from colonial bondage. Yeah. And like I indicated before, liberating the Africans from colonial bondage was just the first of the series of liberation which we were supposed to undergo. I mean, after the political liberation, there was supposed to be the economic liberation. We were supposed to have a social liberation. A social liberation, why? Because you realize that for 500 good years, the Africans have been dehumanized. The African has been, his history has been miswritten. He has even been told he didn't have history. He has been degraded. He was told he was not a human being. He has been made into a commodity, a chattel, I mean, through slavery, who could be bought and sold and used as any tool or machine to grow cotton or to build skyscrapers or to work in the mines. So after the political liberation on the African continent and in the Caribbean elsewhere, there was also the need for the liberation of our minds and of our personality. And that's epitomized in what Nkrumah called the African personality. But a bit of the historical background for today's celebration is that in 1958, on the 15th of April, 8 independent African states, that is Egypt, Tunisia, Liberia, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guinea, and there's an 8th one, met in Accra, plus the liberation movement of Algeria and the United People's Congress of Cameroon. They met in Accra for the All Africa Conference of Independent African States. Indeed, that was the first conference of independent African states or of African peoples in Africa.
Interesting.
Yes. And its aim was to create awareness and heighten the fight for the decolonization process. And I must say that within 2 years, we had about 17 African countries gaining independence in 1960. And by 1963, 32 African countries had gained independence. But it didn't stop. So that conference on the 15th of April put up the African Freedom Day to be commemorated by all Africans on the 15th of April every year, so that we create the awareness, we educate people, we energize the liberation struggle for decolonization and to free ourselves from racism and apartheid in South Africa. In December of that same year, 1958, was held the All Africa People's Conference. The first one was the states, independent states at the governmental level. The second one was for the people. That was for non-state actors plus state actors who met in Accra. And you had all sorts of liberation movements participating.
What was the essence of having the non-state actors and the state actors in 1958? Because I think in the meeting, we had people coming even from the Congo and other places across the country. Yeah. Why was that idea?
Because the main essence of any freedom movement, any liberation movement, is the people. And the states, there's a bit of a disconnect between the states and the people, because you could have a reactionary state. I mean, a state with a reactionary regime. South Africa was independent, but South Africa was not allowed to take part in that conference. Why? Because the South African regime represented only a minority group within South Africa and not the whole of the South Africans. So we must make sure that we do understand. And even today, we need to understand in our history, it's been there. We have had governments, Ghana is touted as being at the forefront, but we have had governments in this country banning May Day and prosecuting people who were organizing May Day in this country. Banning the showing of the picture of their founder, Kwame Nkrumah. If you showed his picture, the law would allow you to be arrested and jailed. So we must always show the two as being separate. So the All Africa People's Conference in December was very important because it allowed all the African movements all across Africa and the African world. And when we talk of the African world, we are talking about it going beyond the fiscal space of the African continent and inclusive of anywhere in the world where there are African people. So they participated in that conference. And of course, the two conferences agreed that the decolonization process and the fight for the African unity was very, very important. And like I indicated, African Freedom Day was first set on April 15. But subsequently, when the Organization of African Unity was formed in Addis Ababa in 25th of May, 1963. African Liberation Day was put on May 25th, 1963. When we talk of African Liberation Day, like I indicated, it is liberation from a certain negative which has been put on us, or which has been imposed upon us. Of course, subsequently, they changed it to Africa Day because the Organization of African Unity, which was to have been the forerunner of the creation of a United States of Africa, was never able to achieve that feat. What it achieved was through its Liberation Committee by supplying material assistance and diplomatic assistance for the liberation of the regimes, especially of Guinea-Bissau, Angola, South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique, and elsewhere in Africa. It did not go beyond just liberating Africans from the external world, external imperialist world. It did not liberate Africans from terrorist regimes. Because within Africa, terrorist regimes grew up. And they were even allowed to play on the African stage. Terrorist regimes in Central African Republic, the Bokassa regime, Mobutu in the Congo, Idi Amin in Uganda, and other military dictatorships elsewhere, all came up. But the OAU did not fight it. They did not fight that second liberation, because the first liberation was to liberate us from foreigners. But the African people were under a double exploitation. The exploitation of the foreigners and the exploitation of their own local elite. And their local elite use all forms of governance, whether fascism, dictatorship, bourgeois democracy, to rule them.
So let's get back to May 25th, 1963.
Yeah.
The African Union is created.
Yeah.
The Africans of that time, in May 1963, a few years later, how did they understand the African Liberation Day itself?
Well, they understood the African Liberation Day to mean the physical liberation of the Africans from the external suppression from the foreign conquerors. But some of them, a large part of them also went beyond that and understood African liberation not to be just the trappings of a formal statehood, having a flag, having a national anthem, just being made a president, and a sovereignty which had no essence. Most of our founding African patriots went beyond that. So they talked of an African high command, which will give muscle for the liberation movement. They talked about an African currency. They talked about an African common market, which will give muscle to the liberation, the economic liberation of the Africans. Because whether we like it or not, 2 generations of colonialism had incorporated us into the Western imperialist and capitalist economy. And the role we had in that economy was at the periphery. And we were the suppliers of raw materials and cheap labor to the metropolis. Were we to remain that, or were we to have a new reality? And it was that reality that most of the leading founders of African space, African world, the past 50 or 60 years had. That was the kind of vision that they had. But as always, when you look at it dialectically, it had to be a struggle. And in the struggle still continues. The luta continua. I mean, we are still on the struggle. And in the struggle, because of uneven development, the loss of uneven development, there will be ups and downs. Yes, and so we have had our ups and we have had our downs. But the main point is for us to focus. And one of the ways which will help us to focus is the celebration of African Liberation Day or African Freedom Day, which can be used to educate us on the tenets of Pan-Africanism, which can be used to drum home the fact that the fight for African liberation is not individualistic, and that is a whole. It is a whole. It is a fight for Africans in London, Africans in the Caribbean, Africans in the Americas, Africans in Australia, Africans in Africa. It's a holistic thing. And if we do understand that there's that unity of the various struggles, for example, we are not talking much about Indonesia's colonialism on the Papuans. The Papuans are Africans. We hardly talk about it. It's hardly in the African mainstream media. But that struggle is part of the Pan-Africanist struggle. And we need to recognize that. And we can only recognize that through this celebration, which is, commemorated worldwide.
So you just mentioned a little bit of the challenges of today, issues that affect Africans around the world, which is not in the mainstream discourse. From your perspective, today, we are May 25th, 2020. How do you see us celebrating African Liberation Day? Like, what are people around the African world celebrating that? And how, if it's not being celebrated properly, what else can we do to fully celebrate African Liberation Day?
You see, you observe that throughout history, any movement for liberation, whether it's even religious or not, is at one time or the other captured by the elite and then bastardized and turned around. For example, you talk of the celebration of Christianity, the Christmas. It has now been turned into a consumerist binge. You understand? And stripped of its spirituality. And that is the danger of the African Liberation Day. Because within the Pan-African world, too, there's a struggle. There's a struggle between reactionaries, those who want the status quo, those who want to have everything to do with the foreign conquerors, and the radicals, those who want change, those who want a genuine African liberation. That struggle is ongoing. And so you realize that now a lot of the reactionaries have latched onto African Liberation Day. They no more call it African Liberation Day. They call it African Day. They give all sorts of interpretations, ideological interpretations to Pan-Africanism in order to strip it of its radical essence, of its true meaning, of what it set out from the onset to do. For us to even be told that, its liberation is over, when we know liberation is not over, when we know that politically we are being controlled, when we know that economically we are in a shambles, when we know that our resources, first 300 years ago, our main valuable resource of physical and intellectual resource was shipped out of Africa to go and build a new world for the Europeans in the Americas. Our gold was also shipped out to form the main currency for the Europeans in their wealth. So these two commodities were taken out. And what did we get? We got velvet cloth for our women, beads, mirrors, drinks, consumer items. And that paradigm has not changed. We sent our people to do cheap labor as illegal immigrants for the capitalist world. Even now, a lot of them die on the trans-Saharan route, like they died on the transatlantic route 300-400 years ago. They go to Europe and they are discriminated against. They are paid menial wages. Like they were sent to the Americas, they were paid nothing. They were given miserly food to build. Then our resources, our gold, our cobalt, our bauxite, our food, cocoa, coffee, what have you, are all sent there for almost nothing. And in return, what do we get? Mercedes-Benz to drive on a rickety road. Their food, ham, pork, for a small class elite to eat. If they don't get the sardines and the corned beef, then it means there's food shortage. Whilst we have our own local food we can consume. So the truth of the matter is that the radicals, the real Pan-Africanists, should be up and fight for the soul of African Liberation Day. For African Liberation Day to continue to have a meaning for the real liberation of the African peoples all over the world.
You mentioned that African Liberation Day, me just correlating what you just shared, that African Liberation Day is tenant into Pan-Africanism, right? It follows the principles of Pan-Africanism. So if you had to share with the world, what are these tenets? What are these principles that bring to Pan-Africanism into the story of African Liberation Day? What would that be?
Well, the Pan-Africanism essentially was a liberation ideology for the emancipation of the Africans from the oppression and bondage it was in. It was not seen within a racist light because oppression and suppression has no color. It is worldwide. It's an unbroken chain, and it affects all sorts of people. Of course, racism as a category was used essentially as an exploiting tool. But it did not, racism actually never liberated the poor whites or the working people, the workers. I mean, the workers in England, they were white people, but they were locked in factories. I mean, 18th century factory in England. I mean, the way the people were being treated was no different from what the black American work on the cotton farm was being treated. You understand? But later on, the capitalists actually used racism as a category in order to be able to separate oppressors, the oppressed, so that they wouldn't unite their struggle. It is the same as the anti-women struggle, that is the patriarchism. It simply tries to divide the struggles so that we don't see that the struggle for women emancipation, the struggle for minorities, the struggle for against apartheid, etc., is one struggle. The struggle for workers' rights is one struggle. So what Pan-Africanism really has to share is that the struggles for our emancipation is in unison with the struggles for the workers of the world for emancipation, for women for emancipation. You know, it's one struggle. Of course, there are particulars of the struggle, but then it's essentially a struggle of emancipation from an oppressor.
So Young Africans sit down in Manchester in 1945. They come out with a declaration, right, for the Pan-African Congress that took place there, where their ideology coming out of the conference was demarcating themselves from other ideas, right? They define Pan-Africanism from a perspective that African unity cannot happen without socialism, having emphasis on scientific socialism. Then these are the same young people who, a few decades later, are leading liberation movement. We speak about Kwame Nkrumah, who became the head of state of Ghana, helping facilitate the organization of these meetings. How do you now see the influence of that conference going into the All African People's Conference in 1958, moving all the way up to 1963 and the creation of African unity? Where do you see that ideology come together, and how can we continue it today? Because as you shared a while ago, these things are being depoliticized, taking liberation away from Africa Liberation Day. It's now Africa Day, where you have banks who are considered themselves as Pan-African banks. How is that possible? So we are celebrating Africa Liberation Day, knowing the ideology taking roots from the Pan-African Conference in Manchester. What will be the trajectory today in being rooted on what actually Pan-Africanism is from the ideology that came out of Manchester?
Well, the fight is on multiple fronts. Like I indicated, there is the fight against those who want to dilute the essence of Pan-Africanism, take it over for their own interest and for the interest of those they serve. But one thing you ought to understand is that socialism is inextricably linked with Pan-Africanism from the Manchester Conference, because socialism was a liberating idea. Socialism in 1917 had liberated a backward country from terrorism, from oppression, from serfdom, almost a dehumanizing form of governance. You understand? And he did not only undergo or undertake this liberation in just that corner of the world called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. It extended help to other oppressed people all over the world. Why? Because their struggle, they realized, was inextricably linked with the struggles of others. One, they also knew that if they did not help their fellow strugglers, their oppressors will come after them. And we have seen it, history, live, how the oppressors came after them, whether through NATO or American imperialism or whatever. That's one. Number two, colonialism is also capitalism. It's a function of capitalism. So you can't fight colonialism without fighting its economic arm, which was essentially capitalist, essentially ownership, property ownership by a certain group of people. Indeed, in Ghana here, who were the colonialists who were benefiting economically? It was the mines and the trading companies. In Ghana here, there were certain parts of Accra, those guys were living, and after 6 o'clock, no black was supposed to be going around there. They had their own hospital, like Rich, like a Fia Quanta hospital, which used to be called European Hospital in Takrady. After 6, no blacks are supposed to be there. And you are not supposed to go to that hospital. It's only for white people. You understand? Why did they build the railway line from Takrady to Takwa? It was to ship goods, first bring in the machines, at Takrady Harbor, send it to Takwa, go and install it in the mines, take the gold from the mines, and then take it outside. And when you go to Takwa, you see where the white people were living, and you see the shacks the black people were living in. And it's very evident in South Africa. It was the same here. Infrastructure was built simply to ship raw materials out. And those raw materials went to help whom? The capitalists. To build the capitalist world, so to speak. And so the idea and essence of Pan-Africanism indeed was fighting colonialism, which was a function of capitalism. So by extension, it was fighting capitalism. And the tools to fight it was to use socialist tools. And what are the socialist tools? To bring about the unity of all oppressed people, led by the working people, in order to make common the ownership of the resources and use those resources to better the lives of all of us, instead of bettering the lives of only the elite. And that is my understanding of Pan-Africanism in essence, it's that.
So we are here now, Africa Liberation Day, and we know that Africa is not free.
Yeah.
We are still struggling with supporting and liberating our comrades in Western Sahara. We have countries across the continent that are still suffering from oppression. We can talk about our people in the islands, Rodrigue, who are still being subjected to inhumane conditions. We can talk about the different wars and conflicts that's happening. But when we see all these conflicts on the African continent, we only see it from a national perspective. There is a conflict in the Congo. There are massacres in Somalia. People in Sudan, particularly in South Sudan, are also going through rages, right? That all these struggles are only seen, they are seen separate. But from the history of Pan-Africanism, the history of Africa Liberation Day, we see that in the 50s, the struggles united. What were the elements that really helped beyond the conferences? Right? What were the elements that helped the Africans of that period unite to create the common front that we could use today to not see the conflict or the struggles of other Africans as a separate struggle, but to see it as a common struggle?
Well, I suppose the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester brought together most of the leaders of that generation who led the struggle. And there were also meetings in Paris, etc., etc. The Kwame Nkrumah, in his independence declaration, made a very significant quote, which I quote, that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it's linked with the total liberation of Africa. You see, the truth of the matter is that any organism which exists, if there's a foreign matter within that organism, it's a danger to that organism. So long as there remain unliberated African states in Africa, it was a danger to the independence of the independent African states. So it was in their interest to ensure that like-minded independent countries were also created. But it didn't stop at that, because when the enemy realized that it was an unstoppable thing to give independence, they started putting up their puppets. So a typical example of where the people rejected their puppet and the consequences was Guinea, where they said, no, we want our genuine revolutionary party to lead us into independence in 1958. They took everything, including the tables and the chairs. That's France. Took everything. And we know France and its attitude, because France itself if you know the history of France, you realize that even after the revolution in 1789 in France, when they overthrew the feudal regime, economically it has not really been up to. So you realize that even when they were thrown out of Haiti, they were able to unite with their friends, come back and force the Haitians to pay a huge indemnity, which the Haitians paid because they are liberated slaves right up to the 1930s. You realize that now the formerly independent countries of France in Africa, they keep a huge part of their reserves in the French Central Bank, which is used to shore up the French national currency. They pay the French a whole lot of indemnities, etc., etc. Colonialism in another form. To the extent that even in La Côte d'Ivoire, the presidential palace which the president was living in, was owned by the French, and they were paying rent to the French. So if you have all these things which are not natural to real independence of the people, because I told you that the independence, the liberation, goes beyond the titular political titles. It goes within the core of the economic and social fabric of the people. Then you realize that it's a problem. And one of the ways for us to be able to fight it is for the unity of the peoples. The various groups, youth groups, women groups, social groups, economic groups, etc., which represent the people genuinely and who understand the problems of the people. And the problems of these people can be attributed to foreign interference and oppression and an elite exploitation of the people. It is that the unity of these non-state actors that can be used as the most effective tool to fight for the real genuineness of African Liberation Day, and thereby for our real independence and for struggle.
So this unity is pretty much the solution you are putting forward for a revolutionary Pan-Africanism today, pretty much.
Yes, because solidarity amongst people who have the same problems, the same struggle, and understanding of the fact that the struggle is indivisible, it's one struggle, is a sine qua non for us to move forward. And it is not a struggle of only black people. It's a struggle of native Indians being oppressed in the Americas, whether in North America or in South America. It's the struggles of minorities, wherever they are in the world. It's a struggle of women. If we don't emancipate women, more than half of humanity is under bondage. Then what kind of struggle are we talking about? So it is the unity of all these struggles that is the antidote to fighting against oppression in whatever form it may take.
As we're coming to a close of this presentation, what would you like people around the world to know about African Liberation Day, a message to the youth of Africa, wherever they are, on this day as we are trying to revive the Pan-African spirit of African Liberation Day?
Well, my message is that simple, that the youth forms the greatest number of the population in Africa and elsewhere. And that dependency, which is a mirage anyway, but we are made to think that we are so helpless, we should be dependent on others for everything. It is wrong, it's not right. And that self-reliance, looking into ourselves, researching our history, looking for our heroes, the resistance, the history of resistance amongst us, the history of the unity with other groups is important for us to know in order to equip ourselves, in order to lay the foundations for today's solidarity for all those who are struggling for freedom and liberation. And Pan-Africanism can do that. And it's unfortunate that African unity is taking the path of copying the European Union. Yeah, you understand? Because that was not the original intention of the Organization of African Unity. The European Union is a union of capital against the labor. Pan-Africanism is not so. African unity is not a unity of capital, because we ourselves, our capital is subservient to that of imperialist capital, European capital, and American capital. You understand? So, on this day, I want us to hold aloft the banner of solidarity. I want us to remember the oppression under which the Cubans and the Venezuelans and the Iranians are undergoing against the Yankee imperialists, Americans, warmongering. Pan-Africanism is for peace. It's not for war. If it goes to war, then it's a just war. It's a just war against the evil of apartheid. It's a just war against the evils of colonialism. It's a just war against the evils of exploitation. Other than that, it does not undertake wars of conquest. But the Americans who are against Venezuela is for the resources of the Venezuelans. Against the Cubans, it's for the resources of the Cubans. Against the Iranians, it's for the oil of the Iranians. And that can't be right. We must always be on the side of right. So that's my message for this auspicious day of African Liberation Day.
Thank you so much for making the time to speak with us. And I hope wherever you are in the world watching this video, you will remember the struggle of Africans who fought to come together and bring an end to colonialism, who are still in the fight to liberate themselves. On this African Liberation Day, the struggle continues.